people. And it's like we've all seen the game of telephone. If you just do it among children, you'll get clearly the reason that we actually teach them sometimes the game is to show how a message will vary by the time it gets 2 or 3 people deep. And I think the question is, how reliable is that source? And when you can get 4 or 5 people that say, we were in the room, that didn't happen, and they go, yeah, I know you have 4 people who were actually there willing to go on the record, but we're not going to accept because we have 2 people who knew 2 people that follow them on Twitter, that you have to weigh that difference of who the sources are. And I don't think that that's getting as much of a play as it should.
Isn't that sort of a two-way street, though? Because even the president will tweet things, and he will tweet things like, for instance, that he's being surveilled, or he was surveilled by President Obama, and it's like, we don't get the sources on that. And yet, the rather dramatic assertions.
Well, I think that there's a question, though, about how this happens. We have asked for an investigation in that front through appropriate channels that were I mean, a lot of that material is at a classified level. And so
after the bomb was dropped.
Huh?
Essentially after the tweet. I mean, the tweet came first from the president.
I understand that. But what I'm saying is that there's also how a classified information gets handled is a whole separate discussion. Because, again, I think that we've seen, and you've seen both very bipartisan outrage on this, there is a level to which classified information is being shared with journalists and others who are not cleared, and that presents a danger to our country. And I think while journalists sometimes want to toil in this and people want to read the sensational story, there's a reason it's classified. It's because it threatens the safety of the United States and that there are sources and methods that are being protected. I think that we shouldn't be applauding the leaks of classified information. I think the president is right to call this out as a major concern. And I think that you've seen people on both sides of the aisle who've been involved in this world to call that out, that it is concerning when we have classified information and sources that are being used to perpetuate a narrative. And again, if you think about it, it ties your hands when you go to respond, because you can't, just because you claim that you know something classified and you call up, you can't then, we can't then fight back on it because it is classified. So us engaging in that conversation puts us in a very difficult spot.
Well, and I'm not to belabor a point, but this is a city where virtually a lot of things get classified that probably don't need to get classified.
I don't know.
I mean, for decades there's been an overclassification in this city, which
well, I mean, but that's a whole separate. To your point,
but not an insignificant one. I mean,
I think on matters of national security, when you are talking about sources and methods and the use of certain things for inappropriate purposes, that is not an overclassification.
The president tweeting. I mean, he says he's going to continue to tweet, and I imagine it complicates your job somewhat.
Well, I think that's the default narrative, but I also think that when you realize that he has an ability through all the channels that he has, well over 100 million people that he can reach out to. And I think some of the media's frustration is that he does have this direct line to the American people where he can communicate accomplishments, thoughts, and pushback to false narratives and false stories that frustrates people who want to control that narrative.
I think another way to look at those, he drops some stink bomb essentially, and then in 140 characters or less, and then leaves, and there's no sort of follow-up, so there's no sort of give and take. So
well, again, but I think that for a lot of people, especially outside of Washington, they have yearned for an authentic voice that is not trying to script everything perfectly, as a lot of politicians have done. And the president, even if you disagree with him on policy, I think one of the things that people, give him high marks for is keeping his word and being authentic. And I think that is something that has been missing a lot of times in Washington.
But again, not to belabor, but if you don't have the give and take, if you can't do a follow-up, that's
but
the
we
problem.
do. I mean, again, I would argue that if you look at our engagement, the president, in terms of myself and him and other members of the staff, we are engaging with the media and with outside groups and coalitions and individuals and unions and members of Congress on an extremely robust way, so that there is follow-up, there is a discussion. It is not sort of in a vacuum that's occurring.
Last night he gave an interview, and it was that I read this morning, in which he said that the U.S. is not going to go into Syria. Did you see that?
I did.
Okay. One of the things he has also said is that he's not going to telegraph his plans. He has now just telegraphed to Assad and ISIS that he's not going to go in. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think that's specific to ground troops. I think there's two issues. One is that doesn't mean, how we're going to deal with ISIS as a whole. So if we have to deal with ISIS and it moves into Syria, that's one thing. I think going in and occupying Syria for the express purpose of regime change is something that the president's been very clear on that throughout the campaign. So I think to sort of try to extrapolate that, I mean, this is something that he talked about well into the campaign, that the use of force and the use of military troops and something like that. So that shouldn't be a shocker. That's been something that he's been talking about for a while.
So so Assad should not take it, his comment, that we're not going to go into Syria, to mean that he's not going to do another airstrike necessarily.
Oh, absolutely not.
So that's still on the, that's still.
100%. And I think the president said that in the same interview, that should they continue to use gas, especially against children and babies, that the president, all options remain on the table. But make no mistake about it, I think the president showed last Thursday night that he will use decisive, justified, and proportional action to right wrongs.
Secretary of State Tillerson is in Russia today, in Moscow, and do you know if he's going to meet with Putin? Has that been confirmed or not confirmed?
It has not been confirmed.
Okay. Do you know if he's going to meet with Putin?
It has not been confirmed.
All right. I'll leave it at that then. I won't give you another follow-up. Assuming he were to meet with Putin, hypothetically, if he were to meet with Putin, what would be his mission? What would be the mission? What's the message to Putin?
Probably. I mean, I think that there's going to be two folds at the front of the agenda. Whether or not he's going to meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and he will communicate the same message, which is, number one, I think there is a shared interest in defeating ISIS in the region, that we have a national security concern that should align with their national security. And then with respect to Syria in particular, we've all been party to an international agreement on the use and possession of nuclear weapons, of chemical weapons, and that Russia should live up to its obligations. Remember, Russia right now is an island. It's Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Iran. That is not exactly a group of folks that you want to be associated with. Russia is, among that group, the only non-failed state. So if you're Russia, you are really isolating yourself by aligning yourself with Assad and not calling out the actions that both you and he specifically said that you would not engage in.
So, but what are the consequences? I mean, suppose that Putin...
I think we had a consequence Thursday
Some
night.
consequence, but suppose today that Putin, should this meeting occur, hypothetically, suppose Putin says, okay, I get it, no chemical weapons, but I'm going to help Assad with his barrel bombs and everything else there, because I like my base in Syria, and I'm going to do everything to prop this guy up. Meanwhile, Assad just continues to annihilate civilians and push refugees out of the country.
I think, first and foremost, we have a shared interest in not only defeating ISIS, but stability in the region. I think that is something that we can talk about. Russia is in Syria. I think we can all agree that defeating ISIS should be, and stability there is important. And then I think with respect to regime change, we can't possibly see a stable and peaceful Syria in the future with Assad in charge. So we can have that discussion with them. I'm not going to, I will let the Secretary of State have that discussion with his counterpart at this point. But I think we have projected our interests and concerns to Russia very clearly.
All right, the USS Carl Vinson is steaming its way towards the coast of DPRK of North Korea. Kim Jong-un has had his provocative words, which he has done before, but they've had 5 nuclear tests and they've had multiple missile tests recently. What's the end game on this? Are we just waiting for Saturday to see if Kim Jong-un does something, has another missile launch on the birth date of Kim Il-sung, his grandfather, or what's the program?
I think we need to get the world community in agreement, particularly China. I mean, we've had very productive talks with both Japan and South Korea, but China can play a very important role, and something the president discussed with President Xi last week, Thursday and Friday, about again, this is almost like Russia with ISIS, but we have a shared interest with China of making sure that we don't have a nuclear North Korea.
We do have a nuclear North Korea. We do. I mean, they have a nuclear weapon. They have 20,000 artillery weapons on the border facing
They have
its
short,
soul.
medium-term missiles. Again, I'm not going to get into discussions about their nuclear capability. I would just say that it is in our shared interest to not have them have the nuclear capability to fly and launch rockets with nuclear capability. And I think that the president had very productive talks with President Xi last week. And I think we need to continue to make sure that the world community stands strong with us, which they have, to make sure that we all understand the threat that North Korea poses.
I don't pretend to have the answer to North Korea at all, but that's the same thing that we heard from President Obama before President Trump, President George Bush, 43 before that, President Clinton before him. Nobody's been able to in any way deter North Korea, and it keeps inching forward.
Yeah, well, I would.
What's different now?
I would just say that I'm not. One is I would go back to last Thursday night. We also had, 6+ years of the last administration drawing red lines and saying that they weren't going to do anything. This president took very decisive action. The world community, a bipartisan domestic group here applauded the president's action. I think with North Korea, as I mentioned, the president's had very productive talks with President Xi. Those, we'll see where those talks land.
What
again,
could
I think
China do? What do
again,
you foresee
I don't.
China doing?
This is not a discussion that is one that you have in an open setting. I believe that the president and a lot of the cabinet had very productive talks with China. There's a lot of stuff that can happen diplomatically to continue to isolate North Korea and to undermine their ability to possess and launch nuclear capabilities that threaten us.
Well, we have historically had very little intelligence about what's going on in this hermetically sealed nation.
And I'm not going to.
But let me just go before that. If China's the purse for North Korea, if China were to cut off money to it, I think, and I don't know, it's just a guess, but I think is that the Kim Jong-un has had no problem just starving his people.
Well, I think that China plays a both economic and political role of influence in North Korea. But we'll see. Again, I think this president has clearly shown both the country and the world that there's going to be a change in how the U.S. interests are pursued, and we'll have to see how that shakes out.
All right, tax reform. Are we going to get it this year?
I feel I know that the president and a lot of members of Congress want to do this on two fronts.
Why aren't they doing this now? I mean, it's like, why can't they multitask?
Well, they are multitasking.
Congress on this?
No. But respectfully, I don't think that's true. I mean, we've actually talked about this for the last couple of weeks. The meetings that we've had internally and externally, we've met with the Ways and Means and Finance Committee and leadership. It's interesting how a couple of weeks ago it was we're rushing too quick on something, and then we talk about the other day on multiple occasions how we're laying out a very systematic plan to engage folks. I mean, tax reform hasn't happened since 1986.
I'm not saying that's easy either.
No, but
I'm
you're
just asking where are we on it?
But I think that we've been talking about this, and so I've literally probably been asked about this multiple times in the briefing and laid out where we are in the process. We've had internal discussions. We're starting to engage with stakeholders. They've started to engage with members of Congress, but we've gone 30+ years without comprehensive tax reform. There's a lot of people who have a lot of ideas on two fronts. One is on the corporate side, we have a big problem with our corporate tax rate maintaining and growing businesses here in the country. They are fleeing our country. And I think this president is committed through both tax reform and regulatory reform to create a better business climate that allows companies to stay here, to want to start here, and to grow here. And you're seeing the progress on a lot, especially on the regulatory front. The president's made tremendous progress.
You can do those by executive order, though.
Yeah, and he has.
But the comprehensive tax reform has got to get this thing up Capitol Hill to move.
Absolutely. But I think on the regulatory reform, and I think that gets overlooked a lot, one of the things, whether it's the automotive sector, the steel sector, the coal and mining sector, and a lot of other manufacturing sectors, that we're seeing a lot of progress. Companies coming back to the United States talking about investments they're going to make, because I think the president's accomplishments and actions on regulatory reform is creating a better business climate for them to be here. But there's the other piece of this, which is the tax piece. It's going to take some months to get this done.
And believe me, I actually am more critical of Congress on this. The president just said we're going to have it, and he's the leader, but Congress is the one who's the engine for this.
Right.
Congress has got to do this.
And we're engaging with them.
So we'll be by the end of the year.
That is clearly our goal, and I think we've got to look at both the corporate side and then making sure that we really give some relief to middle-class Americans.
In light of the fact that by the end of the year, and if there is comprehensive tax reform, there's going to be a huge revenue shift one way or another. And do you expect that it'll be effective as of the year 2017, or do you think, are we talking sort of prospectively the tax?
Well, that's going to be part of the discussion. So to get ahead of when that reform would go into place, whether it's fiscal year 2017 or fiscal year 18, again, that would be probably part of a lot of the discussion. President
Trump also spoke about Steve Bannon last night and about it appears that there's some sort of feud going on in the White House, or maybe feud's a strong word, but something between Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon, at least by the president's remark. What's going on there?
Well, I think a couple things. Number one, I think a lot of it is overblown, what you see in the media. The president has brought together an unbelievably talented team of successful individuals, whether it's in business, academics, government, and there's a lot of opinions. But that's frankly, it's the same team in a lot of ways that had a very successful campaign. I think sometimes you see some of that spill over into public, and that's unfortunate because there's going to be on policy issues a very spirited debate. But I think that's very healthy for the president that he's not getting a monolithic group of advice that says you only should do this and here's how this is. He gets a lot of opinions and ideas and policy shifts that help guide his ultimate decision making. That's a very healthy thing. And I think that what we bring together is a lot of really talented individuals, whether it's Mick Mulvaney and his service in the Congress and his understanding of the budget process, or Steve's understanding of where the policies that the president campaigned on and how to enact them, or Jared's business acumen. There's a lot of things that are being done to help improve the government, to help enact policies that I think both keep us safer and help grow the economy. But there's obviously, going to be spirited debates. I think that is a healthy way for the president to get guidance and ultimately make decisions.
Does the media get in the way of the White House doing its job? I mean, do you feel is this a distraction?
In what way?
I mean, in terms of we report about the feuds. I mean, we're all we ask questions about those things. In many ways they're important because these are important people in the White House. We've got the president's two top aides seemingly having disagreements, and we don't know the extent of it and whether it's just an ordinary course of business, two people with two different ideologies, or if it's something more.
Well, I think from a process standpoint, whether or not someone's getting along or not getting along, or whether or not one idea is getting floated or another, doesn't make anyone's life safer or better, right? And I think, to your question, I think the more that the focus is on what are we doing, right or wrong, to make the country better, to strengthen it, to make it safer, is where I'd love to see the focus, right? Is that, what are we doing on tax reform? Where is it? How are we getting done? Who's being involved in the process? What are we doing to make our country more competitive and to grow jobs? Because I think whether or not you live in California or Connecticut, your focus right now is, am I doing okay? Am I able to help my family? Am I able to help my kids? Am I saving something for the future? Is my job safe? Is the business that I work for growing? Am I going to be able to get a raise? Am I able to contribute to my 401k? Are my streets safe? Is my country safe? Those are, I think, the issues that most Americans worry about and plague, that concern them. What am I doing about health care premiums? How am I going to keep up? Can I actually go see a doctor anymore? My guess is that that's whether or not you live on the East Coast or the West Coast, North or South, those are the issues that most Americans, I think, are waking up, not whether or not two individuals or three individuals are, going back and forth in the White House. So I understand that there's always going to be a little palace intrigue, but I think that the proportion that I've seen of palace intrigue versus policy is a little out of whack.
All right, what's your wish list? If you had your wish list about the media, I'll give you a chance. What do you want? What do you want? What do you want to change? Well, how can
we only have a minute and 50 seconds left? I will look. It doesn't really matter. In all honesty, the media's got a job to do. We've got a very robust media in this country, both right-leaning, conservative, left-leaning, and so I think as long as we have a healthy and robust media, I'm fine. I wish more people would focus on the policy and get it right, but it is what it is. This is the beauty of living in a free country. And so while I may want a lot of things, I think what we all should want is a media that takes their time, gets the stories right, doesn't worry about being first, but rather being right.
All right. How much do you like the job? 1 to 10.
I love it. I know that people the funny thing is, that is probably one of the things that people say all the time. Like, oh, I truly do believe it's an honor to have this job. It is a privilege, and if you don't believe it so, then you shouldn't be here.
All right. Let me ask you about the White House Correspondents' Dinner. We only have 52 seconds. Nobody's going. The president's not going, and the members of the White House aren't going. Your thoughts? Thoughts?
Look, I think that it's,